Welcome to Intro to Psychology 2, and this is Chapter 1, and we're looking at the biology and behavior. And this is an interesting chapter because it's looking a lot at how does our brain and the minutest part of the brain, neurons and neurotransmitters, communicate within our brain to communicate to us how to physically move, how to emote, what to say, what to think, what to do. And we're going to look at the complexity of the brain. And the way I'm going to be doing it is going to show you a bunch of different graphics. Most of them are in your textbook. And I will highlight some of the terms that I want you to be familiar with, so you can go through your textbook, highlight, make notes, make sure you do that, and check off and make little sticky notes to organize your textbook, because when it comes to test time, you're going to be doing a test on 1 or 2 or 3 chapters or whatever it is, and you're going to need to have access to this so you don't have any loss where you are trying to figure out where everything is. So you need to be prepared. It's an exciting chapter, it's an interesting chapter, and in the second part of this chapter I will indicate in the video that there's a place that you can do a journal entry. And it'll be the first of 5 other alternatives that you can do as a journal. You've got to select 4 of them. So this might be your first opportunity by which you can do it, and you can do this activity, do it at home, and then report in your journal with some feedback. So good luck with this, and I hope you enjoy looking at biology in the brain. Okay, we're going to start with the typical neuron. Now, neurons are specialized cells, and they are part of what makes us enabled to think, feel, and act in certain ways, whatever we decide to do. And these cells perform some very important aspects about being humans. And for that matter, neurons are a part of all sorts of mammals and mammals and reptiles as well. So all their behaviors and stuff are all related to this. So there's multiple tasks that they are responsible for. There is the afferent, which is sensory-based neurons, and they help with the basics around sense organs like your eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin, and how it communicates with your brain and your spinal cord. And then there's the efferent motor neurons, which are conveying the signals from your brain through to your spinal cord to the glands and muscles, which enable us to make movements. And then the third part is the intraneurons, and there's 1,000 times more of these types of neurons than there are of the sensory and motor ones. And they carry information between neurons in the brain and between neurons in the spinal cord. And so there's an awful lot of activity that goes on regarding neurons. And what I want to do is I'm going to go through basics about your neurons. And we have thousands of these in our brain and throughout our body. Every neuron is a specialized cell that conducts impulses through the nervous system. It contains 3 major parts to a neuron. There's the cell body, there's dendrites, and the axon. The cell body, it contains the nucleus. It carries out all the metabolic functions of the neuron, whereas the dendrites, and you see this in your diagram on screen, these are branch-like extensions from the cell bodies. And these receive and send messages to other neurons. So the dendrites are the communication lines, if you will, from neuron to neuron and how they interact with one another. And we're going to look at how they do this through the synapses. And then the axon, this is a slender tail-like extension from the neuron. You see it there on your screen joining those 2 neurons. It transmits the signal to dendrites or the cell body of other neurons, to muscles, to glands, and other body parts. And so these are the 3 major parts of what makes up a neuron. Now there are other cells associated with neurons, and they're called glial cells. These are spelled G-L-I-A-L, pronounced glial cells. And these are specialized cells. They're kind of like the caretaker cells of the neurons. They hold the neurons together, they remove waste and get rid of dead cells, they clean up after the neuron cells, they perform manufacturing and nurturing activities within that neuron cell. Now if you look, there's a note there saying synaptic clefts. This is the junction where the axon terminal of the sending neuron communicates with the receiving neuron across the synaptic cleft. Now this is a minute space between neurons where they eventually exchange neurochemical hormones, transmitters, neurotransmitters, and a way of sharing information from one neuron to the next. And this goes on many times for every thought, action, emotion, feeling that we have that gives us a robust experience that we see in our everyday life. So when we look at what's happening in this communication, it's called a resting potential and action potential. And in the resting potential, the cell is negatively charged. It sits kind of dormant at the moment. The cells are either on or they're off. They're not in between. And so the resting potential is off. The action potential, the neurons receive impulses, and the ion channels get open. These are little receptors. If we go back and look at the last screen, sorry, we're going to see it in the next screen, but if you look at where the synaptic clefts are, and then you come back here, what you're looking at would be these neurons open up and they have receptors. These will be these places where neurotransmitters can be received, or chemical chemicals can be received, but it's only during the action phase by which they can receive them. And then they go back into resting and restored to a more positive ion flow out. So this resting, action, resting is on, off, and that's essentially how the neurons communicate. It's not a whole lot different than binary computers, you know, the ones and zeros, if you will. Now, in conjunction with this is we have this. This is a closer look here. If you look at the very bottom where you see receiving neuron, and then you see the synaptic cleft, you're seeing where the receiving neuron has these triangular pieces. And when we go through an action, a thought, transmission of communication between neurons to make things happen, neurotransmitters, chemical substances released into the synaptic cleft from the axon terminal of the sending neuron, it crosses the synapse, and that's those triangular and circular shapes. They're represented that way. That's not what an actual neurotransmitter looks like, of course. They bind to the appropriate receptor. That is to say that every neurotransmitter has an appropriate receptor, and it's like a shape where the right shape fits the right neuroreceptor. And so what you're seeing is those triangular shapes are the right neurotransmitters. They do fit, whereas the circular ones don't fit, so they won't be received. So the receptors, these are protein molecules on the surface of the dendrites and cell bodies. They have distinctive shapes, and they only interact with specific neurotransmitters. And so when you look at what you're seeing there is this very minute space between synapses, or between the dendrites, and that synaptic cleft is the space where this communication occurs. Now imagine this is happening, thousands and thousands of times per second, and it's how we are holding thoughts. It's how we move our muscles the way we do. When you go riding a bicycle, your brain is sending signals to your muscles in your legs, in your arms, and into your conscious mind to keep an eye on the road, to make motions to go left and go right and keep your balance. These neurons are what are communicating this to our body. It's quite remarkable. Excuse me. Now, the reuptake, what this is the neurotransmitters get taken from the synaptic cleft back into the axon terminal for later use. So once this means of communicating begins, this message gets sent, it shuts down. Remember, there's a resting and an action. So that shuts down. It's the reuptake that stores or puts back these neuroreceptors until later, for later use. It terminates the excitatory opportunity where these neurotransmitters get sent, or the inhibitory effect on the receiving neuron. It's a very remarkable process that's happening that keeps all of our functions going. So for example, when you see what you're looking at here, the synaptic transmission, when you look around you and you see things, you're not seeing pictures the way it appears. There's not an inverted image that goes to the back of your eye and then your brain sees the image and translates it. Your eye is picking up wavelengths, and it's those receptor cells in the back of your eye that lead to the optic nerve, which translate those light waves into neurochemical transmissions that go through the neurons, like what we're seeing here, this receptor cell sites and the neurotransmitters. This is what communicates to the rest of your brain, which makes an understanding of what your light waves coming through your eyes have seen. And so the image that you actually see is the image that your brain creates based on the light wave that's bounced off the back of your eye. It's quite remarkable. And if you look at all your senses, this is how they're operating. Now, the variety of neurotransmitters are wide and varied. They can include acetylcholine, which this is a neurotransmitter that causes excitatory effect on the skeletal muscles and the fibers, causing them to contract so our body can move. That's one neurotransmitter. There's many. Norepinephrine, this is the neurotransmitter that affects our eating, our alertness, and our sleep. Epinephrine affects our metabolism of glucose and causes stored energy to be released during exercise. And another neurotransmitter, serotonin, is important in the role of regulating mood, sleep, impulsivity, aggression, and appetite. And so we find there's a variety of these neurotransmitters. Some of them are things that we use every day, some not so much. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. GABA is an inhibitor. And then endorphins, these are chemicals produced naturally by the brain that reduce pain and the stress of vigorous exercise. If you've been a runner and you've run long distances, you're training for a marathon or a half marathon, then it's quite possible that as you've trained and worked very, very hard, these chemicals will be expressed in order to reduce the stress of that training, to give you the sense that you're doing well and you have a good feeling. It affects positive mood. Now, all of this connects as well to the human nervous system. And when we look at the human nervous system, there's a central nervous system which is related to the brain and the spinal cord. And we have the peripheral nervous system which carries information to and from the central nervous system. And there's a somatic and an autonomic nervous system, which is then further broken down in sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. And we're going to look at these. Excuse me. If you look at the human nervous system and its relationship to the brain, we can look at these different structures. And in particular, we can look at the hindbrain, which is a major structure. If you look at the blue section, this is the area that we would be considered in our hindbrain. Hindbrain. The pons is a relays messages between the cerebellum and the motor cortex. And we'll talk more about the cerebellum and the motor cortex and its role that it has in the way that it affects our behavior. It influences our sleep and our dreaming. Then we have the medulla, which is a control center for heartbeat, breathing, blood pressure, swallowing, and coughing. Basically things that we don't pay attention to. We don't control ourselves. We don't, for the most part, consciously think of our heartbeat every moment of the day. But our medulla is the control center for these sorts of activities that keep us alive and keep us ticking. The reticular formation is the arousal system and activates the cerebral cortex. And again, we'll talk about the cerebral cortex in a moment. The cerebellum, this coordinates the skilled movements. So anything that you've refined as a skilled activity, you know, even some of the hobbies that you do, driving, riding a bicycle, swimming, these are things that require coordinated skills. It regulates muscle tone and posture and has a role in motor learning and probably some roles in cognition as well. Now the forebrain, now this will be up in the top section in sort of the burgundy, purpley color. Here's where parts of the brain that include the thalamus, which was a relay station between the cerebral cortex and the lower brain section. So you'll find that each parts of the brain communicate with one another through neurons, but also through the connections that exist between the brain itself. The limbic system, and we'll look at that a little more in a bit, it's a group of structures involved in the emotional expression, memory, and motivation. And so what you'll get out of the limbic system is this sort of what we might describe as somewhat of a human experience, the emotions that come along with being human. The corpus callosum, this is an interesting component that sort of holds the two parts of the two hemispheres of the brain together. The corpus callosum is a band of nerve fibers that connects the two sides of the brain. Now, also, when we think of the forebrain in the thalamus and the hypothalamus, the thalamus is a structure above, it's located above the brainstem and acts kind of like a relay station. And the hypothalamus is a small but influential brain structure that regulates hunger, thirst, sexual behavior, internal body temperature, and other body functions, and a wide variety of emotional behaviors. So there's a lot of activity that occurs in control centers and relay centers that the brain has, functionally enabling us to do so many of the things that we sort of translate in an everyday experience that we really don't give it a thought. Now, in the limbic system is more towards the center and the inner part of the brain. The thalamus, again, it's the relay station for information in and out of the forebrain. The hypothalamus, again, it's about hunger, thirst, body temperature, and those sorts of elements that help control the endocrine system. The amygdala, this is an important part about role for the emotional response to unpleasant and punishing stimuli. It's part of the old part of the brain, so it's also where the flight and fright response comes from when we talk about unpleasant or punishing stimuli. It's important to our survival. It's also a very old part of the brain. The hippocampus, this is largely what we would consider our memory storage area. It also has roles in navigation, seeing our way around and holding spatial images in our mind, and response for new or unexpected stimuli. Now, when we talk about the cerebellum, and I touched on it earlier, it's the largest structure of the human brain, and it consists of two cerebral hemispheres connecting the corpus callosum, connected by the corpus callosum, and covered by the cerebral cortex. Let's just see what I've got next here. There we go. The cerebral hemispheres, there's a right and a left hemisphere. And we'll look at what the responsibility of each hemisphere is in a moment. They control the movement, the feeling, and the opposite on the opposite side of the body. So the left hemisphere is responsible for the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere is responsible for the left. It's kind of a peculiar way of setting things up, but it's very effective, as it turns out. The corpus callosum, as mentioned earlier, it's this thick band of nerves that connect the two cerebral hemispheres. It makes it possible to transfer information and synchronize activity between the two hemispheres. If this wasn't there, we wouldn't be able to coordinate our left and right hemisphere to give us information about what we're feeling and also about what we're writing and doing with our words. So there's also an interesting component regarding gender, is that women tend to have a more dense, thicker band of a corpus callosum. It would suggest there's a greater ability to communicate with either side of the hemispheres as compared to men, who have a thinner band. When we look at the cerebral cortex, we can consider a number of different elements. We're going to look at the frontal lobe first. This is extended from the front of the brain to the skull's top center. It's the largest of the brain lobes. It contains the motor activity, the Broca area, and the frontal association. Now, the motor activity, motor cortex is in the rear of the frontal lobes. This controls the voluntary body movement. So everything that you decide to do, you control, you make a decision about. This is the part of the brain that's responsible for it. It participates in learning and cognitive events. So when you do your studying and you take action towards studying, whether it's writing and reading specifically about a topic, it's the motor cortex that you're engaging and trying to develop neural pathways that will support the learning you're doing. And this is an interesting point, because when it comes to studying, what studying is doing is practicing material. You're developing neural pathways, and the more you practice, the stronger those neural pathways get, and the more solid that learning gets, the denser those neural pathways get. And then that's what enables us to go from basic learning of a topic to more intense and more complex learning of a topic, is the amount of practice we put into it. And this is all taking place not just in the motor cortex, but with the neural firings that we develop when we learn new information. The Broca's area is the area that's in control of production of speech sounds. So the words that you're hearing from me, my words are being developed out of my Broca's area. That if I got smacked in the side of the head or in some way experienced a head injury in that part of the brain, I could establish or I could experience Broca's aphasia. And this is the physical inability to create speech or speech sounds. Now, this doesn't mean that all other aspects of your life are gone. It just means that one particular area, speech and speech sounds, I may have a great deal of trouble with if I were to hurt that part of my brain. Now, in the frontal lobes, we also have the parietal lobes. This is the somatosensory cortex. This is where body awareness and spatial orientation. So if you're on a trampoline and you do somersaults and twists on a trampoline, it's the parietal lobes that sort of keeps you aware of where your body is in space and ensures that you land on your feet and not on your head. The somatosensory cortex is also responsible for touch, pressure, temperature, and pain register. So while you're doing your jumping up and down on the trampoline, it's recognizing the amount of pressure you've put on your feet as you land, or you're on the trampoline. It registers the touch so you know when you're there and how to bounce back to get to the next move. It monitors your temperature so you become aware as you get warmer. And if you happen to do something that causes you pain, it's the parietal lobes that will let you know you've just been hurt. Now the somatosensory cortex, this is the front part of the parietal lobes. And you'll see this in the green. This is where I'm getting this from. Touch, pressure, temperature, and pain registers here. It's wired to the opposite side of the body, and it's affected by experience. So if I happen to hurt my right side, it's my left somatosensory cortex that's going to respond in my brain. The occipital lobes, and this is in the orange, these lobes are involved with the reception and interpretation of visual information. They contain the primary visual cortex. And as you can see, this is towards the back of the head. Now, this isn't the only area that's responsible, as with all other areas. It's not the only area responsible for that sensory information. It's the primary. Other areas of the brain would be connected. If you were able to light up your brain and see where the neural fibers that are lighting up from things that you're looking at, you would find they wouldn't be only in the occipital lobe. They would be in other areas where you've associated other information to those visual images. You look at a picture of your mom, you see your picture of your mom, the occipital lobe will be firing off and saying, that's my mom, but you will also have your amygdala will be firing off because you've got emotions associated, good and bad, and you'll be, serotonin will be flying through your head. You'll have a positive experience of remembering your mom. So it'll have a whole bunch of neural connections across the brain, not just the occipital lobe. The primary visual cortex is the area in the rear of the occipital lobe where the vision registers in the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is critically important to our sensory information. Now in the light blue, we have the temporal lobes, and these are involved with reception and interpretation of auditory information. So the primary auditory cortex is part of the temporal lobe where hearing registers in the cerebral cortex. The Wernicke area, this is the language area on the left temporal cortex, and comprehends spoken word and formulates coherent speech and written language. Now again, if this is an area that gets damaged, these are the skills that we lose if that part of the brain is damaged in some negative way. That's what's called Wernicke's aphasia. And the temporal association area, these are areas that also involve interpretation of auditory stimuli. And so what we're seeing on this last slide here is just this area to show how the motor cortex on the left hemisphere is being held responsible for these different elements. When you look at a cross section of the motor cortex and a cross-section of the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so what you'll notice is I will have either circled, arrowed, or put in written comments, written words that you should be familiar with when you're doing your studying. I hope what you're doing is taking notes and highlighting your textbook. It's going to help you a lot when it comes to test time and to complete your test. All right, so this is the end of the first part of Chapter 1, and I'll make another video that will complete the last part of Chapter 1. Thank you very much.